Hello there. Today I'm here to discuss a topic that I've brought up at least a dozen times, but I've rarely really gone into a lot of detail on it, a lot of depth about it, and it's very, very common in books that I cover, especially book series that are bad.
This is the introduction song. It's not very good, but it's not too long.
The most I've ever talked about it was in my Angel Fire video a couple of years ago. I'll put the eye up on screen. You can go watch that if you're curious. And I figured that since I keep bringing it up, I should probably just compile all my thoughts into one location. So this is just going to basically summarize what I'm talking about here when I talk about middle book syndrome. Now, first things first, what is middle book syndrome? Middle book syndrome, sometimes also called saggy middle syndrome, is basically just when the story slows down in the middle and nothing really happens. You know, characters just sort of putter around doing stuff and you're just really trying to push through and trying to get through to the end.
I'm so bored!
I'm certain that pretty much all of you have experienced this once or twice. It's when you're reading a book and you're not interested in what happens next. You want to get past what's happening now. You want to get past what happens next so that you can just get to the good stuff. You know, like if you're reading a book and you're thinking, okay, when are they going to be done with this subplot, or when are they going to be done with this plot line so I can get to the good stuff? There's a pretty good chance that it was in the middle of the story. This is when stuff starts happening, like the love interests suddenly will break up over some dumb misunderstanding, or if you're talking about paranormal young adult romances, which I talk about way too much, this will be something where the brooding bad boy love interest will tell the main character girl, we can't be together, I have to go, and for whatever reason he just fucks off into the ether, like Edward in New Moon. And then they're apart for 90% of the book, or even 90% of the book series, until they get back together at the climax, which we all knew was going to happen the whole time. Or something where the heroes will suddenly have to search for a MacGuffin that was never brought up before and will not really be mentioned that much after they find it. It's just a thing that they needed to go and find now because the author needed to fill up some time. Or what if the heroes have to travel somewhere and they just spend a really, really, really long time doing that? Cough, cough, Eye of the World. Look, as much as I like Wheel of Time, that first book took me 3 tries to get through, specifically because it has a really bad case of saggy middle syndrome. Like, for a huge chunk of the book, most of the characters are all separated and we're just watching them all travel to the same place, and man, Rand and Matt just running away from evil innkeepers for about 300 pages, that is not very exciting.
Everybody got that?
You have probably read books or book series that have one or all of these issues, or even some different ones possibly. And most often middle book syndrome is found in trilogies, and that's really just because trilogies are the simplest way to structure a book series, and if I had to hazard a guess, I would say that that's probably the most common way to structure a book series. And the structure of a trilogy is very simple. Book 1 is the beginning of the story, Book 2 is the middle, Book 3 is the end. So if there's problems with the middle, it's going to be in Book 2. Have you ever noticed that in a lot of trilogies, the second book is either the shortest one by a very big margin, or the longest one by a very big margin? But while it's most common in trilogies, it happens in longer series, and it happens in individual books as well. Like I said, Wheel of Time has a lot of problems with saggy middle syndrome or middle book syndrome, because the first couple books in the series are, for the most part, very good and exciting. The last couple books are also, for the most part, very good and exciting, but there's 4 or 5 in the middle that fans of the series just refer to as the slog, because it is a fucking slog to get through, especially Crossroads of Twilight, and that is book 10 in the series. 10 out of 14. Wheel of Time is comically long, man. And exactly what counts as the slog is debated among fans. You know, some people say it starts here, some people say it starts here. It doesn't really matter. The point is, there is a big slog in the middle where a lot of stuff just sort of isn't happening. You know, it doesn't feel like there's any forward progression or forward momentum being made. It doesn't feel like we're moving closer to the heroes overcoming all the odds and defeating the bad guys and the conflict coming to a resolution. It feels like they're just sort of existing. You know, I've also referred to this as plot kudzu once or twice, where the story just kind of spreads out and we get a vague sense of things happening, but it doesn't feel like the story is moving forward. You know, the middle of Wheel of Time has a huge problem with that. Recently I did a very brief summary of Nevermore, which you should go watch if you haven't already, and that is a trilogy, and the trilogy has middle book syndrome. I got book 2 right here. It's Enshadowed, the second book in that series, and basically nothing happens in here. And you can see, it's not exactly a short book either. It's pretty thick, and nothing happens. For the most part, it is just Isabel, the main character, thinking about how she wants to go out and rescue her boyfriend. And she doesn't actually take any steps to do it until the climax of this second book. And look, Nevermore is not a great book series in general, but book 1 had a few things going for it. You know, it's the introduction to this world and these characters, and I thought it worked okay. And book 3 had a few things going for it, but book 2 doesn't have anything, man. Up until the climax, there's just nothing happening. Another book series I covered recently was Article 5, and this has the same issue. Book 1, we're introduced to the main characters, and we find out about this evil government, and at the end of the book they decide, okay, we're going to fight the evil government. And so book 2 is them being rebels, but they don't actually do any rebellion stuff. They mostly just sort of sit around and wait to be attacked and have some weird love triangle drama. Although, granted, in Article 5, the love triangle's actually not that bad. I kind of like the way it was handled, but that's not the point. Throughout all of book 2, they just sit around and wait to be attacked up until near the end when the author says, okay, yeah, something needs to happen now, and then they go off, and then it ends on a cliffhanger, which leads into book 3, where they're actually doing stuff again. You shouldn't confuse middle book syndrome with filler, though, because there is overlap between having filler, which is just there, you know, to pad out the word count, or if it's a TV show or movie, to pad out the runtime. Filler, a lot of people misuse that term, but yeah, that is still a thing. And while it has a lot of overlap with middle book syndrome, they're not quite the same thing. Animorphs is a book series that I know and love, and have loved for many, many years now, but it does have a lot of filler in there. There's a lot of books, especially in the middle of the series, that are largely just episodic adventures, you could say. Like, it's the Animorphs doing something which was never brought up before this book and doesn't really tie into the story at large, and there's not really a general progression of the story, so it doesn't feel like they're getting any closer to defeating the Yeerks and saving the day. But I don't mind the filler in Animorphs, for the most part, because most of it is very, very good. Sure, it slows down the pacing, but it also works to give us a lot of lore about this world. Like, the lore of Animorphs is insane. If you've never read those books, I'm not going to get into it here, but the lore of those books is insane. It also gives us a lot of character development, and it shows these characters' relationships evolve, and it shows how they grow and change over the course of this terrible war that they're fighting. It shows them get better at fighting. It shows them go through moral conundrums. So, like, yeah, even if this isn't strictly necessary to move the plot forward, it's still very good, and it's still a very important part of Animorphs, I would say. So even though you could consider it filler, it's definitely not boring, and it's definitely not middle book syndrome. Basically what I'm saying here is that filler is not always bad, okay? Like, that's kind of a tangent. I don't want to go on about that for a while, but filler is not always bad. So why does middle book syndrome happen? There's probably a lot of different reasons for it, but ultimately what it comes down to is that writers, when they start off, whether they are someone who plans and outlines very stringently, or somebody who just kind of writes as they go, whatever the case is, they probably have a good idea of the beginning and a pretty good idea of the end when they start, but they have trouble filling everything in between. And that's why it's common with trilogies, again, because it's basically just the beginning, the middle, and the end. And especially with, like, young adult trilogies for some reason, and when I say young adult, I mean young adult of various different genres, this is a really big issue, because book 1 will be the intro to the world. You know, this is where if there's any magical or supernatural or science fiction elements, we have to learn about all of that. If it's an urban fantasy with a hidden magical world, we have to show the main characters discovering that world usually. This is also where we're introduced to the main conflict, you know, whether that's just a personal conflict between a small group of people or just two individuals, or it's an internal conflict or whatever, or it's something much bigger and world or universe destroying if the heroes can't figure out how to defeat the bad guys. we are introduced to the conflict in book 1.
Everything's gonna be okay.
You don't know that, Deandra.
Shut up, Mother.
And this is also where the love interests meet, and usually they have fallen in love and confessed to each other before the end of book 1. Then in book 3, that's where we have the big final battle, the big confrontation. Again, whether that's them trying to save the world or just them trying to have some sort of internal battle or whatever. And then they have their happily ever after between the love interests, usually, and all secrets and mysteries wind up getting revealed, so we truly feel like we understand this world by the end of it. That's book 3. So what is book 2? Book 2 often has an identity crisis, so it just devolves into taking up some time, because obviously you can't just give your audience instant gratification all the time. That wouldn't work out at all. So you have to take up some time and you have to make them wait for it, but you still have to keep them entertained while waiting. And I'm aware that I'm making this sound really difficult and complicated, but that's because it is really difficult and complicated. Writing is hard. And again, I'm mostly talking about trilogies here, but it applies to the middle of stories in general. So how do you fix or avoid middle book syndrome? Basically, what it comes down to is just structure. Like, you structure your story well, you structure your story well, and you structure your story well. If you can't do that, then you're probably going to run into issues with this sort of thing. One of the best examples of an individual book that could have very easily run into this problem, but it handles it almost perfectly, is Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. Because you see, in that book, Harry is fighting in the Triwizard Tournament, right? And there's a much bigger conflict going on in the background, but we only get hints of that at first. So Harry is going through the tournament with all these different challenges, and for each challenge, Harry has to find out what the challenge is first, then he has to spend time preparing for that challenge, and then he has to actually go out and do it. And those are all very difficult, but the whole time, it feels like progress is being made. And while all this is going on, we're getting little hints about the wider mystery. So we have these smaller miniature conflicts which are being introduced and then resolved, and one at a time, they are moving us closer to resolving the big conflict, and we get to that big climax at the graveyard. The final book, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, is pretty similar, because the big goal that they have is that they want to defeat Voldemort. In order to do so, they have to find and destroy all his Horcruxes. So one at a time, they have to track down his Horcruxes, find them, and then steal them, and then they have to try and find a way to destroy them as well, and this escalates things, and they move closer and closer to finally being able to defeat the bad guy, and then we get to the climax, which is the Battle of Hogwarts, and they do defeat the bad guy. So there's this constant sense of forward momentum and escalation and feeling like the heroes are actually doing something. They aren't just, sitting around and waiting for shit to happen to them, like, again, Isabelle in Nevermore. Again, go watch my video on that if you haven't. You'll know what I'm talking about. But they aren't just sitting around and waiting for things to happen to them. They are going out and making things happen. And so the conflict is slowly getting resolved. And it works really well. And since I'm mostly talking about trilogies, I have to talk about a trilogy of books that avoids the middle book syndrome problem. The original Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. In the first book, we have all that stuff with the Lord Ruler. In the last book, we have all that stuff with Ruin, who is, if you haven't read the books, he's basically just a god of destruction. And in the middle, we still have some great stuff, but this is all really one big conflict, and it's all connected, but at the same time the conflict evolves in each book. Because in Book 2, The Well of Ascension, the heroes are dealing with the aftermath of everything that happened in Book 1. Like, sure, they defeated the big bad in Book 1, but there's still a lot of minor antagonists that are around that they have to try and deal with. So there's still a conflict going on, and again, there are hints that there's something even bigger waiting on the horizon. The characters and their relationships also evolve and change, but it doesn't feel like they're just trying to throw in drama for the sake of it. Like, again, if Brandon Sanderson was a lesser writer, which, granted, I think he's become a lesser writer in a lot of ways since Mistborn, but that's a separate discussion.
You need to leave!
But if Brandon Sanderson was a lesser writer, Vin and Elend would probably have broken up in Well of Ascension for whatever reason, and then they would have spent most of the book apart, and possibly going into the next one even being apart, and then they would have reconciled and gotten back together before the end, which, again, we all knew they were going to do the entire time. But that's not what happens. Instead, it feels like their relationship evolves and there's some tension between them, but it's also clear that they do love each other and they want to try and make this work, so they don't have the cheap, oh, we can't be together, or oh, I hate you now all of a sudden type thing. And just like the first book ends with them defeating the big bad, as we think, and then they have to deal with the smaller antagonists in the second book. In the second book, they defeat all the antagonists that they have, but it ends on a cliffhanger where in the third book they realize, okay, we're going to have to deal with the real big bad. So while, yes, it is technically all one conflict going through, the conflict evolves and goes to a different stage every time. So it helps keep things feeling fresh all along, and it never feels like the heroes are just spinning their wheels or sitting around doing nothing. They are progressing, and the story is moving forward the whole time. So in other words, Well of Ascension is a great book in its own right. It's not just a bridge between Mistborn the Final Empire and The Hero of Ages. And I think that's what middle book syndrome comes down to at the end of the day. Like, middle book syndrome or saggy middle syndrome is what happens when the writer views the middle as just being a bridge. You know, it's just there to get from point A to point B. But the middle of a story can't just be a bridge. It can't just be there to get you from point A to point B, because if that's the case, then it's going to feel like a waste of time, and it's going to feel very unsatisfying, even if the beginning and the end are great. The middle has to be an integral part of the story. It's not just a bridge. Throughout the whole thing, there have to be things happening that the audience cares about. We have to be getting more information about whatever central mysteries there are. We can't just be introduced to the mystery and then have it revealed to us near the end. And same with stuff like characters and character development and their relationships. You know, we have to see them slowly grow and change. We can't just have them introduced and then they're a different person at the end. Depending on how you look at it, the middle is the most important part, because, to paraphrase something that people say over and over again in the Stormlight Archive, the journey is what shapes us. You know, journey before destination. That is the important part. That's a huge theme of that series. And I'm not going to get into that series right now, but basically, middle book syndrome is what happens when people put destination before the journey. And I think that's about all I have to say here. This is basically just summarizing all my thoughts on this and putting it in one place where people can find it. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Like, are there any books or book series that you think did middle book syndrome really well or really badly? Or rather, I should probably say, are there any books or book series that you think avoided middle book syndrome versus ones that you think suffered from it really badly? But I don't know, I'm just curious in hearing more people's thoughts on this, because this is really just my opinion. I haven't seen many other people discuss this much, so I don't know, just let me know what you think. Have a lovely day, and goodbye. Hello there, friends. You watched this far, you know who I am. You see all these names here? These are the names of my patrons. My $10 and up patrons are Arthur D. Gonzalez Martin, Brother Santodes, Carolina Clay, Chibs Ahoy, Jace Spades, Lexi DeLorme, Lord Tiebreaker, Michael and Katie Hake, Mr. A5013, Proscriptions of Zhuojang, Psych XS, Slumbering Jellyfish, Observing Outer Space, Tesla Shark, Toa Michael, Vevictus, and Wesley. Without these guys, I could not do what it is I do. If you want to get your name here, then consider donating to my Patreon. If you don't feel like doing that, you can also become a YouTube channel member, get access to exclusive videos once a month. You also get early access to all my regular videos. But if that doesn't appeal to you, or you just, for whatever reason, don't feel like doing it, like this video, comment on it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, share the video around. That helps immensely. You can also check out my merchandise store down below. I got t-shirts and stuff for sale. Buy them before, you know, the tariffs completely render them unaffordable for everybody. Goodbye.